I never thought a silent man at a ski lodge would teach me how to speak again. But there he was, every single night, sitting at the same corner table by the fireplace, saving the seat across from him like he was waiting for someone who never showed up. Until the night I finally sat down and his silence became the loudest thing I'd ever heard. My therapist told me to get away for a while. 6 months after the breakup with David, I was still walking around my apartment like a ghost, haunting his own life. I'd stopped answering calls from friends, stopped going to the gym, stopped pretending I was okay. The ski lodge in Vermont seemed random enough, far enough from Seattle that nobody would know me, remote enough that I could disappear into the snow and maybe figure out how to come back. The lodge itself was one of those places that looked like it belonged in a different era. All exposed timber beams and stone fireplaces big enough to stand in. The kind of place where people actually talked to each other instead of staring at their phones. I hated it immediately, which meant it was probably exactly what I needed. I noticed him my first night there. Hard not to, really. He sat alone at a table in the corner, closest to the main fireplace, with 2 chairs even though he was by himself. Late 40s, maybe early 50s, with that particular kind of stillness that military guys have. You know the type. The ones who look like they're always on alert even when they're relaxed. Salt and pepper hair cut close, flannel shirt rolled up to reveal forearms that spoke of physical work, not gym memberships. He was nursing what looked like whiskey, neat, and reading an actual paperback book. Not a Kindle. An actual book with bent corners and a cracked spine. What struck me most was how he'd glance at the empty chair across from him every so often, like he was checking to make sure it was still there. Then he'd go back to his book, take a sip of his drink, and the cycle would repeat. I watched him do this for maybe 20 minutes while I ate my dinner alone at the bar, and something about it made my chest ache in a way I couldn't quite name. The second night, I watched him again. Same table, same chair, same routine. The bartender, a cheerful woman named Marie who seemed to know everyone, caught me staring. She leaned in with a conspiratorial smile and said, "That's James. He's been coming here for 3 years, same week every winter. Always saves that seat. Never seen anyone sit in it." There was something sad in the way she said it, like she was letting me in on a tragedy I hadn't earned the right to know yet. By the third night, it became a strange kind of ritual for me, too. I'd finish skiing, take a too-hot shower that left my skin red and angry, put on clean clothes that still felt wrong on my body, and head down to the lodge's main room. I'd order something I barely tasted, position myself at the bar where I could see his corner, and watch. It sounds creepy when I say it like that, but it wasn't like that. It was more like watching someone perform a private ceremony, something sacred and solitary that I couldn't look away from. He never seemed to notice me watching. Or if he did, he was kind enough to pretend he didn't. He'd arrive around 7, order his whiskey, open his book, and wait. Sometimes people would approach him, lodge staff or other guests, and he'd nod politely, exchange a few words that I couldn't hear, and gently redirect them away. The message was clear without being rude. He wanted to be left alone, or more accurately, he wanted to be alone together with whoever was supposed to be sitting in that empty chair. On the 4th night, something changed. I'd had a particularly brutal day on the slopes, not because the skiing was hard, but because I'd spent most of it in my own head, replaying every fight David and I had ever had, every moment I should have spoken up and didn't, every time I made myself smaller to make him more comfortable. I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. When I came down to the lodge, I ordered a double bourbon instead of my usual beer, and I didn't sit at the bar. I don't know what possessed me. What moment of courage or stupidity or desperation moved my feet? But I walked directly to his table and stood there, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. He looked up from his book, and for the first time, I saw his eyes. Gray-blue, like winter sky just before snow. There was surprise there, and something else, something that looked almost like relief. We stared at each other for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 5 seconds. And then I gestured to the empty chair and said, "Is this seat taken?" My voice came out rougher than I intended, scratchy from disuse and fear. He didn't say anything, just shook his head once, a small movement, and gestured to the chair with his hand. I sat down, and the moment I did, something shifted in the air between us. The noise of the lodge seemed to recede. The crackling fire became the only sound that mattered, and we sat there in silence, two strangers who somehow weren't strangers at all. That's when I realized what I'd noticed but hadn't consciously registered before. He wasn't just quiet. He was silent. Completely, utterly silent. And now that I was sitting across from him, I could see why. There was a scar on his throat, faint but visible in the firelight, the kind of scar that spoke of violence and survival. His silence wasn't a choice. It was a fact. I should have felt awkward. I should have made an excuse and left. Instead, I felt the most profound sense of calm I'd experienced in months. We sat there for maybe 10 minutes, neither of us speaking, because neither of us could or needed to. He'd dog-ear a page in his book, take a sip of his whiskey, glance at me with those winter sky eyes, and go back to reading. I nursed my bourbon and watched the fire and felt something in my chest that had been clenched tight for half a year slowly begin to unwind. When I finally stood to leave, he reached across the table and touched my hand. Just once, just for a second, his fingers rough and warm against my skin. Then he pulled back, nodded at me, and returned to his book. I walked back to my room feeling like something significant had happened, even though nothing had happened at all. The fifth night, I didn't even pretend to consider sitting anywhere else. I walked straight to his table, and he looked up with something that might have been a smile, though it was hard to tell with him. Everything about his expressions was subtle, muted, like he'd learned to communicate in a language that didn't require sound. He'd already ordered me a bourbon, I noticed. It was sitting at my place, the ice just starting to melt. That small gesture hit me harder than it should have. We fell into a rhythm. He'd read his book, I'd watched the fire, and every so often one of us would look at the other and something would pass between us. Understanding maybe, recognition, the acknowledgement that we were both here because we were running from something, or maybe running toward something we hadn't found yet. After about half an hour, he pulled out a small notebook and a pen from his jacket pocket and wrote something down, then slid it across the table to me. The handwriting was precise, almost architectural. It said, "Thank you for sitting with me, James." I took the pen and wrote back, "Thank you for saving me a seat, I'm Alex." He read it, and this time there was definitely a smile, small and sad and real. He wrote again, "I save it every night. You're the first person who's ever sat down." Something about that confession made my eyes burn. I wrote, "Why do you save it?" He hesitated, the pen hovering over the paper for a long moment. Then he wrote, "For whoever needs it. Didn't know it would be you." We passed the notebook back and forth for the next hour, having the most honest conversation I'd had in years. He told me about Afghanistan, about the IED that shredded his throat and took his voice, about the 3 surgeries that saved his life, but couldn't give him back the ability to speak. He told me about coming to the lodge every year on the anniversary of the day he got injured, about how sitting in this spot by the fire and saving that seat was his way of honoring the men who didn't make it home, the ones whose seats would stay empty forever. I told him about David, about how I'd spent 3 years making myself quiet to avoid conflict, about how I'd lost myself somewhere in the process of trying to be what someone else needed. I told him about the apartment I couldn't bear to be in anymore, about the job I was probably going to lose because I couldn't focus, about the way I'd started to feel like I was disappearing even when I was standing right in front of people. He wrote, "Sometimes the only way to find your voice is to sit with someone who doesn't have one." That sentence cracked something open inside me. I excused myself to the bathroom and cried for the first time since David left, actually cried instead of that hollow aching that had become my constant companion. When I came back, red-eyed and raw, James just nodded like he understood, because of course he did. He slid the notebook over again. It said, "Come back tomorrow?" I wrote, "I'll be here." The 6th night, he taught me how to play chess. He had a beautiful wooden set, pieces worn smooth from years of use, and we played 3 games without speaking a word out loud. I lost all 3, but I didn't care. What mattered was the way he'd pause before moving a piece, giving me time to see the trap he was setting, teaching me without condescension or impatience. What mattered was the way he'd nod when I made a good move, or shake his head slightly when I was about to make a mistake, giving me the chance to reconsider. Between games, we wrote to each other. Small things, mostly. I learned he was a carpenter now, that he built custom furniture for people who appreciated craftsmanship, that working with his hands helped quiet the noise in his head. He learned that I was a graphic designer who hadn't designed anything in months, that I used to love hiking but had stopped because David thought it was boring, that I missed my sister but was too ashamed to call her and admit I was falling apart. He wrote, "Call her. People who love you want to know you need them." The seventh night, I told him I was supposed to leave the next day. My week was up. I had to go back to Seattle, back to real life, back to the apartment and the job and the slow process of rebuilding myself from scratch. He nodded, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely sad. We played chess again, and this time I won one game, which felt like a gift he'd given me, though I couldn't prove it. Near the end of the evening, he wrote, "I'm here same time next year. The seat will be saved." I wrote back, "For who?" He wrote, "For whoever needs it. Maybe you again. Maybe someone else. Maybe me." I realized then what he'd been doing all along. The empty seat wasn't just for the fallen, it was for the lost. For anyone brave enough or desperate enough to sit down and be seen in their silence. He'd been saving it for 3 years, waiting for someone to understand that sometimes the most profound connections happen without words, that sometimes you need to sit with someone else's pain before you can face your own. On my last night, the 8th night, I brought him something. I'd spent the afternoon in the lodge's small business center, designing for the first time in months. It was a simple piece, really. A graphic print of a table by a fireplace, 2 chairs, one empty and one filled, with flames that turned into wings rising up behind them. Underneath, in clean typography, it said, "The seat is saved. Sit down." I gave it to him and he stared at it for a long time, his fingers tracing the lines I'd drawn. Then he pulled out his notebook and wrote, "This is the most beautiful thing anyone's ever made for me." I wrote, "You saved my life. You know that, right?" He looked at me, really looked at me, and wrote, "You saved mine too." I was starting to think no one would ever sit down, was starting to think maybe I should stop saving it. We sat there until the lodge closed, until Marie gently told us she needed to lock up, and then we stood in the parking lot under stars so bright they looked fake. He pulled me into a hug, and I let myself be held by this silent man who'd shown me that connection doesn't require conversation, that intimacy can exist in the space between words, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is sit down in a seat that's been saved for you. When I got back to Seattle, I called my sister. I told her everything, and she listened, and she said, "I've been waiting for you to let me in." I started designing again, really designing, pouring all the things I couldn't say into images and color and form. I didn't get back together with David because I realized that what we had wasn't love. It was just 2 people trying to avoid being alone. I started therapy again, real therapy, the kind where you do the work instead of just showing up. And exactly 1 year later, I drove back to Vermont. I walked into that lodge, and there he was, same table, same book, same saved seat. When he saw me, his whole face transformed. Not a smile exactly, but something better. Recognition. Joy. The acknowledgement that I'd come back, that the seat he'd saved had meant something, that neither of us had to be alone in our silence anymore. I sat down, and he slid the notebook over. It said, "Welcome home." I wrote back, "I brought someone for you to meet." His eyebrows raised in question, and I gestured to the door. My sister walked in, looking nervous and hopeful, and exactly like she always did. I'd told her about James, about the saved seat, about how sometimes broken people need to find each other. She'd been divorced for 2 years, had stopped believing in connection, had forgotten how to let people see her. She needed a saved seat too. James looked at me, then at her, then back at me. He wrote, "There are always more seats." And there were. That night we pulled another chair to the table, and the 3 of us sat by the fire, passing the notebook around, telling our stories in written words and comfortable silence. Other people started to notice, started to drift over, started to ask if they could join. By the end of the night, there were 7 of us around that table. 7 people who'd all been looking for a place to sit down and be seen. James started coming to the lodge more often after that, not just once a year. And every time he did, he saved seats, plural. He'd set up his table with 4 or 5 chairs, and people would find them, people who needed to know that somewhere in this loud, overwhelming world, there was a place where silence was welcome, where you didn't have to perform or explain or justify your existence. You just had to be brave enough to sit down. I still go back every few months. Sometimes I sit with James, sometimes with my sister, sometimes with strangers who become friends through written words and shared bourbon and firelight. I've learned that the most important conversations often happen without speaking, that presence is more powerful than words, that saving someone a seat is another way of saying, I see you, you matter, you belong here. James and I never became what you might traditionally call a couple. Our connection existed outside those definitions, something deeper and stranger and more necessary. He taught me how to be quiet again, how to exist in my own skin without apology, how to save seats for others the way he'd saved one for me. And in return, I taught him that his silence wasn't an ending. It was an invitation, a space where people could bring their own noise and have it transformed into something bearable. Last month, he sent me a photo. He'd built a table, a beautiful piece of cherry wood with a built-in chessboard and 6 chairs around it. The craftsmanship was stunning, every joint perfect, every surface smooth as glass. The caption said, "For the lodge, so there are always enough seats." The veteran at the lodge saved me a seat every night, and when I finally sat down, his silence taught me how to speak again, not with words but with presence, not with noise but with attention, not with explanations but with understanding. He showed me that sometimes the most profound act of love is simply making space for someone else's pain and saying, without saying anything at all, you can rest here. You are welcome here. The seat is saved, and it's saved for you. Total char count, 16,847.